So, I've been going through a bit of video game burnout. It goes like this. I'll wake up, make some coffee, grind some dailies, run in circles for a bit, and then scroll my Steam library before giving up and doing something else. But strangely enough, the games I end up wanting to play the most are the ones I'm nostalgic for. I gave in and started grinding through some of them with the goal of getting a few 100%, and I made it through a few of those before I had the wherewithal to start recording again. So, in an effort to hopefully get through some more of them and share that experience with some of you, I'm going to grab this tier list maker right here and put some of these games that I finished there because tier lists are cool. Anyway, this isn't going to be a review or anything like that, but more of a log of my experiences trying to get each achievement. There will be spoilers, so if you just wanted to know whether or not this game is worth completing, I'll go ahead and let you know that yeah, I think it is. For the most part. The achievement progression feels great, and all of them are doable with a reasonable amount of time investment, I think. For players that aren't super confident in their skills, a lot of the harder achievements end up being doable if you can be patient and learn from your mistakes, or with a guide in the worst case scenario. There are a select few I'll go into more detail on later that end up being a headache, but they don't take much away from the overall experience in my opinion. That said, here's Resident Evil 7.
Welcome to the family, son.
Like I said, this was supposed to be for nostalgia more than anything, so I was expecting to load up and find my old save waiting for me. I did not, in fact, find it. So I had to do a whole new run on normal before I could start on Madhouse, which was fine, since I had a few easy achievements I could get while speedrunning through. This turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Dealing with me in the guest house wasn't nearly as bad for my nerves as it was when I beat her for the first time back in 2021, but Jack was a different story. I don't know what it is about these games. Getting my arm chainsawed off? Fine, whatever. But put an unkillable psychopath that never stops chasing me on my way, and I'm spent, man. I also got to see this scene, which I somehow missed on my first playthrough, and that fully reignited my anxiety. My plan was to get these gimmicky gameplay achievements and use psychostimulants to find collectibles because I didn't want to resort to a guide if I didn't have to, and I figured abusing saves with psychostims would be enough to help me find them all. Little did I know that I had already missed my chance, since one of the coins was back in the intro. Collectibles in this game aren't nearly as egregious as they are in other games, but they're still pretty annoying. They come in 3 different flavors: antique coins, Mr. Everywhere bobbleheads, and files, and each comes with their own flavor of unlockable. Files are for lore and help to shed some light on the events surrounding the story. Bobbleheads unlock special items that carry over to subsequent saves if you find all of them, and the antique coins unlock powerful upgrades for the current playthrough. In normal difficulty, those upgrades are extra health, faster reload speed, and the Magnum. Anyway, those are all pretty great, but I unfortunately didn't find all of any of them without a guide. While it is possible to use psychostimulants to help find the bobbleheads and coins, there are some that are tucked away in areas where there are no psychostims. Some of them are really hidden, like the aforementioned coin in the intro sequence. There's no way more than like 1% of players find this on their own. And it's a real shame, because it ended up being the one set of achievements I had to use a guide for in the end, making it feel more like a pain point than an achievement. At least there are enough easy to find coins to grab the Magnum, which I did, but I'm getting ahead of myself. By the time I was safe from Jack for the first time, my aspirations of speedrunning this first playthrough were out the door, and I ended up taking my time and immersing myself in the Baker house instead. I beat Jack once, made it through the basement, and grabbed my first achievements and starting again by beating him a second time. Feels good. By this point, I was locked in and fully enjoying myself. I got to the old house where I sliced some bugs up, and I bashed Marguerite for 2 more achievements. Then I spent some time collecting items in preparation for the boss fight against her. I hadn't begun popping the psychostimulants yet, but I was finding so many items by pressing my nose into the corners of everything that I don't think I ever really would have needed to. I became well acquainted with all the out-of-the-way item spots for my Madhouse playthrough, which did pay off in the long run, but if I were to do it all again, I wouldn't have bothered. You get so many items, at least in normal, that it's completely redundant to find everything, but it is super satisfying to find all the hidden goodies, and feeling safe because you're so loaded up on ammo and healing that nothing stands a chance. By about halfway through, I had enough shotgun shells to retire my pistol and solely rely on the boomsticks, which I'll talk about more later. I died a couple times trying to time Marguerite's jump well enough to get the Back Off Mrs. B achievement, but it wasn't that bad. I also absolutely ammo dumped her with the flamethrower, and it was about this point when I started to really dislike it. It has no knockback or stagger potential most of the time, and the damage just really isn't great either. By the end of this completion, I genuinely believed the flamethrower might be a contender for worst Resident Evil weapon of all time, but I haven't played them all yet, so I'll reserve my judgment for later. Seriously though, this thing sucks on everything but the bugs. Every time I was stuck with it and had to spend hundreds of fuel to still get slapped in the face by a molded, it felt like a special kind of torture. The next obtainable achievement for me was to finish the birthday tape in less than 5 minutes, so I blasted through the house until I got the tape. It took me a few minutes to remember what to do, but once you have the solution, 5 minutes is plenty of time to essentially cheat through it.
Happy birthday.
Once in Lucas's gauntlet, there's another gun repair kit, and I could finally fix the broken shotgun from the house. I don't think I found both in my original playthrough, or at the very least, I didn't appreciate how much of a beast the M21 was back then. This thing is insane for how early you can get it. I finished Lucas's portion using what I had left of the flamethrower, the pump, and normal handgun bullets. Then I threw them in the chest to rot, while I blasted Jack down for the final time with my overpowered arsenal. I also went ahead and mixed what I needed to finish the first place at the science fair achievement. Then there came the ship. Mia's section here is probably my least favorite section in the game, just because it is so self-contained it feels like it serves more as a story intermission than an interesting gameplay experience. I do enjoy the sections of gameplay that aren't linear, but compared to the amount that are, it drags on after you've seen it once. I think because you start with no items in a way, it's supposed to feel like you're helpless again, like you're back in the house with Jack for the first time, but it's just less effective than that, and it's partially because the molded are easier to deal with, and partially because you're only helpless for one small section. Once you get access to explosives and the machine gun, Mia is like a commando, and it's just business as usual. Towards the end, where the fat molded shows up, I had hoarded enough bombs to make sure I could get the achievement for blowing it up, but didn't realize he had to do a special grab in order to trigger the prompt. So this one took a bit longer than it should have, but I got there in the end. And now the final section, the mines. I grabbed the machine gun, the pistol, the double barrel, and I popped some psycho stems because I'd given up on trying to be conservative with them, and started off. The double barrel absolutely decimates enemies even at this point in the game, so if I didn't know how good it was before, I definitely did now. The machine gun, however, put up a poor performance, so in my mind it was only marginally better than the flamethrower, and I kept that knowledge in my back pocket for later. Like I said before though, I had more than enough shotgun shells to carry me through. I also used every grenade I had saved up for the launcher because it felt like I had neglected it for too long up till now. It's a pretty good weapon for what it is, but it can't replace the double barrel in my heart. And as I approached the end, I blew myself up once. I let Evelyn kill me once for good measure, and then I finished my playthrough. Starting back through a normal was a fun experience, and I was happy that I got to get reacquainted with the game because the real challenge starts now. I found my collectibles guide, and I hopped straight into it. Now, in Madhouse there are a few notable differences besides the obvious bump in difficulty. There are a lot more antique coins, and it has its own separate achievement for finding them all. There are also more and better rewards to spend them on that ended up being a welcome help. These are the Scorpion Key for early access to some extra items, and 2 coins that boost attack and defense by a tiny amount. Items and enemies are switched up in location and variety, and saves now require cassette tape that is consumed. The first thing that jumped out to me is how long this intro is. I appreciate that it sets the atmosphere for that visceral first playthrough, but it's not the most fun thing on repeat playthroughs. It makes me miss how something like Resident Evil 4 just kinda threw you in head first after a skippable cutscene. Anyway, after this walking sim portion was done with, I fought Mia, and she was way more difficult to kill. It actually scared me how many blows it took to drop her in the intro sequence. Especially in the attic, I'm not sure what I would have done if I hadn't grabbed the axe to chop her down when I ran out of bullets. After that, in the house proper, I began to scour around for any items I could use. This is when I found the separating agent item for the first time, and it can be used on another item to separate it into its components. This was worrying because it meant that finding items and using them in general was probably about to be a lot more difficult. I really didn't want to contend with Jack and burn through my limited supplies, so I was super grateful when he got caught on this door and gave me a free pass. I was so happy. Until he beat me to death in the garage, and I realized that I hadn't saved yet, so it restarted me from the beginning again. Saves ended up being the most terrifying part of Madhouse because I was stingy with the new tapes that were needed to save, and dying potentially meant repeating large chunks of the game now. The second time around, I wasn't so lucky with Jack, but the Secrets of Defense Unlockable was a godsend, because as long as I could guard against him, he did minimal damage. The second fight went much better because I used the Albert 01R, and the increased damage stretched my finite bullets way further, and he dropped. Unfortunately, Madhouse's next trick was reviving him way before I was expecting, and this was probably the most stressed I'd been since starting. I'm actually stressed just watching myself again while editing. Naturally, I ran straight back to the save room and burned another tape. In a moment of panic, I started blasting his face as he'd cornered me in the living room where I needed to grab the dog head from the clock, and thankfully he dropped again. Then this happened.
You're wasting your time!
After reorienting my mouse that I'd dropped from the jump scare, I had to waste even more bullets to stop him from chasing me again, but at least this time I was able to make use of the downtime to grab the rest of the antique coins and escape into the next section of the house. Then there were the molded. Man, these guys are way tougher, and there are more, and they're in different places, and the crawlers are already here. Great. Surely the basement will go swimmingly. Nope, I died to the first molded down here. It was here that I found enhanced bullets could one-tap the heads of the regular molded, so this would be how I dealt with multiple at a time when I had the luxury. Enhanced ammo with the Albert was really just insane in general, so I spent nearly all of my enhanced chems on this during the run. With that figured out, the rest of the basement wasn't so bad. I took the time to scavenge for as many items as possible, including a trip back up to grab the Scorpion Key and the pump shotgun before the boss fight, because Jack thankfully stops roaming up top after his basement cutscene. With that, I had more than enough resources to put him down quickly. And by quickly, I mean after dying once, of course. I also didn't realize the chainsaw took up an inventory slot, so because of my full inventory, instead of grabbing that, I just dumped a bunch of enhanced ammo into him. This fight really showcases how ridiculously powerful the Albert is with it, because one headshot made him vulnerable, and another stood him up, keeping him perpetually staggered. With all 3 dog heads, I went to the trailer, and surprisingly found the grenade launcher waiting for me right out in the open. The repair kit wasn't in the same place, but it was strangely still very close by. I didn't make the same mistake as normal mode in using it on the handgun, but instead used it on the double barrel that was locked behind the Scorpion Key. I also had enough antique coins by now to cash in for the assault coin. I felt really good about my arsenal now, so I wasted no time heading into the old house, and assembling the flamethrower too. Despite my disdain for it, it was undoubtedly the best weapon to use on the bugs here, so I was very liberal in applying it to them. Marguerite is so much easier to deal with than Jack that I was almost disappointed that she had no new behaviors on Madhouse, at least as far as I could tell. I let her wander off once and didn't have to deal with her again until it was time to roast her. I did gently remind myself that the Albert sucked against molded without any enhanced ammo, but otherwise continued on unabated until the showdown with old Longlegs. With all of my strongest weapons in tow, I had more than enough to crumble her, but I was dangerously low on healing. I found some herbs and chems after searching around the arena though, and it's another interesting point to make me appreciate Madhouse even more. While it does pull the reins on item drops, it does it in a very controlled way where you'll still always have just enough to make sure you're not completely doomed, even in the worst case scenarios. In other words, it's very finely tuned, and that makes for a great experience. The bigger issue is balancing the limited inventory slots with the buff items, and I really enjoyed this trade-off. I had enough coins now too to get the defense coin, so I did that before making my way to grab the arm at the end of the molded hallway here. Going back through the house at this point was a walk in the park thanks to the double barrel one-tapping all the molded, and it went a long way towards replenishing my supplies. The start of Lucas's section is the same, and going through the barn isn't much more difficult than anything else I've done up to this point, except for the crawlers being hard to shoot at when they're zigzagging around like the little rats they are. It's only during the fat molded encounter that things spice up, because now there are 2 big boys, and that makes for a lot of spit. And if I wasn't certain about the flamethrower before, I was now, because it does next to nothing to these guys. On the second attempt, I just benched it, because healing was way more important than conserving ammo, so I finally decided to get some use out of the neuro rounds I'd been saving, and old Reliable finished the job. I ran back to spend some coins on the stabilizer after solving Lucas's uninspired escape room again, and got ready to finish Jack, which I expected to be pretty tough. It was. This dude was a tank this time around, taking multiple pistol and shotgun shots to each eye. Thankfully, I had hoarded an armory's worth of shotgun shells by this point, and I got him on my first try. I had to choose Zoe here to get the alternate ending, and I think I like the banter between her and Ethan more in this cutscene, but man, he's stupid. I also think it's weird that Mia is just randomly here now, but that's plot, I guess. Being reacquainted with the ship made this section a lot faster, but Madhouse keeps you away from a gun for a lot longer, so it was still kind of stressful, and, dare I say, more fun. It feels like a proper intermission segment since the gameplay is different without being able to fight back. With that said, playing as Zoe could have been done with a couple alterations, and not letting you play as Crazy Mia at all feels like a missed opportunity, especially since she changes at the end to try and kill you for being a bad husband anyway if you pick Zoe. And you do get ways to defend yourself later on, like explosives and the machine gun, though I started dying more when I tried. Maybe all this is why the ship section feels like it falls a little flat compared to the rest of the game. It's the little things. Let me know if you have any opinions. Out in the swamp lies the final coin for the first achievement I've seen in a long time, and I was ecstatic to see it since it meant I didn't miss any. Big weight off my shoulders. I spent them on the Magnum, made quick work of the molded, and went down into the mine. It was business as usual again as I cleared out the molded and evaded the traps. In the lab room, I finished the All Files achievement and breathed another sigh of relief. One more long inventory management stop and it was already time for the end. I expected this section to be flooded with molded, but it wasn't all that different from the normal mode gauntlet outside of a few of them being upgraded to stronger versions. Ironically, I died once at the fat molded again because the one thing I apparently hadn't gotten better at was using explosives. I busted into the house and shot the final Mr. Everywhere for the final collectible achievement, outside of the coins I'd have to get on the next playthrough. And to wrap it up, I dumped everything I had into Evelyn, which was by far the easiest thing to do all run. Madhouse complete, and it was all in all more fun than normal, annoying save system aside, and probably one of my favorite difficulty increases of all time. Now it was time for a victory lap. I immediately loaded into easy difficulty. It was time for a speedrun. Sort of. I don't have enough patience to think I could ever call myself a real speedrunner, but I had to finish the game in under 4 hours this time. I also wanted to get the rest of the non-DLC achievements this run, so the challenge was to collect the coins that I'd missed on that first playthrough, avoid using the storage box, and avoid healing. With that in mind, go ahead and cue the abysmally slow intro. There's nothing much to say here except I spent a lot of time anxiously waiting and that it was very apparent that easy would be easy. Go figure. The need for speed pushed me to do some reckless things that I otherwise wouldn't have tried, and it was like a breath of fresh air. I learned some interesting things, like how Jack had to get in the car before he died because there's no way he survives this many slashes otherwise. I definitely felt my aim was better than before, and killing enemies that gave me so much trouble, even if it was like cheating playing on easy, was quite satisfying. I genuinely think that the gunplay of this game, while not amazing, is a lot of fun, so the most enjoyable sections for me are the ones where it's just a lot of blasting. This makes the basement one of my favorites. Not using the item boxes was difficult because my reflexes demanded I pick up every single item I came across, but I had to temper myself, instead only picking up the items I knew I'd need, at least to the best of my ability. It was also kind of sad because the infinite ammo I unlocked from beating Madhouse was in there and I couldn't get it out until way later in the game now, though it was kind of refreshing too because I spent way too much time fussing with items up till now. I was running low on ammo here, so I had to rely on the chainsaw to deal with Jack. It seemed that as long as he didn't hit me directly, I could still stand toe-to-toe with him despite having next to no health. Here's a fun fact about the no healing achievement. Because the achievement itself says no first aid meds, steroids don't count. So I could grab this one here and get a much needed full heal. I immediately sprinted over to the old house and used my knife to cut down the insects, looting as I went. Marguerite may as well have not existed here. One of the few snags I ran into is failing to realize the trigger to send her crawling down the tunnel is reading the note on the case here. Lame. Anyway, I ran out to the trailer to grab the Magnum, popped some Psycho Stems to get some quick supplies, and proceeded to burn her lanky ass to death. After this section, I wanted to get rid of the flamethrower, but it once again proved to be a thorn in my side, as you cannot discard key weapons like this. Getting the key cards proved to be a difficult point in the inventory management department because of this, until I remembered to get the backpack from Evelyn's room. I finally let my curiosity get the best of me, and I had to check the wiki page for this axe to find out what it did. I never would have figured this out on my own, and I was a fool for thinking I could. Inside the box was another stabilizer that I didn't know existed and was happy to have, though I wish I would have gotten it on Madhouse too. I was doing really well on shotgun shells by the time I fought the fat molded this time, so he didn't make it out of the elevator. Before and after the escape room are 2 of the 3 times you have to access a storage box, so I finally had the opportunity to grab all of my overpowered unlockables, including the infinite ammo. The rest of the run was in the bag because I didn't really need to look for items anymore. I sprinted to Jack, taking down the molded on the bridge with my God Magnum, and Jack didn't fare much better. I picked Mia this time so I didn't have to fight her later and got on with the ship. There's not a lot to say that I haven't said already, so I basically just tried to get through it as fast as possible without caring too much about items. Psych! It turns out I'm just a nasty little loot goblin, and I definitely spent too much time sniffing corners. Still, 4 hours is more than enough time, and I was still in good pace by the end. The mines went as you might expect them to go, with infinite ammo on a 3rd playthrough on easy mode. I grabbed my gear from the storage crate with my final legal usage of it and proceeded to enjoy the fruits of my labor. I wasn't even tempted to use bombs on the fat molded this time. One more walking sim section later and my achievements were granted. Finally, I'd fully conquered the main campaign of this game. I enjoyed all of my playthroughs a lot, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't ready for something new at this point. And that's what the DLC is for, I suppose. Believe it or not, one of the big reasons I wanted to do this video at all is because the DLC surprised me so much, and I felt compelled to talk about it. The first time I played this game, I only went through each one once, and not even all of them, just for the sake of it, but they have so much more to offer for completionists. Like before, I don't want to spend an exorbitant amount of time talking about what each one is, but I'll briefly summarize and talk about the interesting points. First, I tackled the collection of mini DLCs, starting with the Nightmare minigame. This is like a Horde mode for old Gears of War fans, or Zombies for Call of Duty fans, to put it as simply as I can. Remember when I said that the gunplay was pretty fun? This is the game mode to scratch that itch, and I'm super happy they added it, even if it's not super fleshed out. It has its own progression system where you simply get points for surviving waves and saving up money, which add up over each run and unlock new options at certain thresholds. It does add a degree of replayability, but what would have gone even further than that is different maps to play on. I think the basement is a good map, mind you, but variety is the spice of life and all that. And now that I'm thinking about it, most of the areas in Resident Evil 7 are just different flavors of corridors anyway. The basement is probably the best area they could have chosen. That aside, I really enjoyed the couple hours I spent here. I died on my first try, but cleared normal on my second. Unlocking some of the extra guns like the machine gun and flamethrower helped more than I expected, because the ammo for each gun has a separate cost that increases per time you buy it, so having more guns helped keep the cost down and the bullets flowing. It also meant more money to spend on traps, which were a big help, especially the turrets. I'd had enough adrenaline after the first clear and took a small break before diving into the real challenge of Night Terror, which I'll circle back around to in a minute. Next, I loaded up Bedroom, because while I'd beaten it before, I had to find the rats to unlock another achievement. This one is pretty straightforward as long as you look very thoroughly throughout the room, memorize the setup so that Marguerite is satisfied, and figure out how to deal with this stupid lock. Honestly, I think it's another novel take on an escape room that's made a bit more annoying than it needs to be. Reloading and repeating the steps each time to make incremental progress sucks, and it doesn't really add anything to the experience besides frustration. At least it's a one and done. Next was Daughters, and this is a really neat addition because it connects Zoe to the story more, and I think she needed it. It's also genuinely unnerving, a bit frightening, and also frustrating. It's easy enough getting the bad ending, but getting the true ending and the achievement I needed required finding some obscure items and taking them to the right place at the right time. Which meant retrying twice, which didn't take long, but again it didn't need to. Plus the alternate ending isn't that satisfying, and doesn't give you anything besides the achievement either. I got it eventually, but I was happy to move on. Then there's the infamous 21 minigame, which seems to be pretty hit or miss amongst the community. This minigame in particular was one I wanted to talk about. So the gist of it is blackjack, but there's only 11 cards between both players, no repeats, and trump cards that affect the hand or the stakes. Now, because there are only the 11 cards, you can make pretty educated guesses on what the opponent has or what the next cards might be. On top of that, the trump cards are handed out frequently enough that you almost always have a play beyond hit or pass. The trick is figuring out what the optimal move is based on the situation. And when I say optimal move, I mean the game generally has something planned for you. It's just up to you to recognize the patterns and adapt. More about this in a sec. So you start out by playing an introductory game that's intended to show you the rules, but by the end you start to understand the way the game wants to cheat you and how it expects you to cheat back. This trump card, for instance, essentially means you have to have saved up your own trump card to force your opponent to lose. If you don't have it, then they will win. Simple as that. The next challenge, then, is to beat 5 opponents in a row, but there's another unannounced curveball. Each opponent has a different patterned bag on their head, and this is an indication of what strategy they're likely to use. An important distinction to remember. My strategy was to hoard as many trumps as I could get my hand on, but as I went further and further with my hoarding tactic, I began to notice a pattern. It felt as if the game always gave me the tool I needed to win the hand, assuming I played quote-unquote perfectly. I don't really know how to describe it best, but it felt like I always did have the right trump, the right draw, or the right guess at the right time. I ended up one-shotting survival mode without even losing a single hand, and then I noticed that there was a challenge for winning the next mode, Survival Plus, without losing a single hand too. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems pretty impossible based on luck alone. Not across 10 whole opponents at least, and with the feeling I already had, it felt like I'd uncovered some kind of secret truth. I unlocked a few more trump cards for winning survival, which would prove to be a massive help in finishing up the 10 opponents for my final achievement. And while I unfortunately didn't record that streak, I did in fact get it by playing a very patient game. I was able to get all the way to the final opponent without losing a single time, and thought I had a really good chance at getting the ultimate challenge finished, but alas, the final dude cheated so badly that I couldn't help but fumble it. I finished him off with one single life point remaining, and I am so happy I did because the one thing that really sucked about this game mode is how long the animations take. It's so annoying waiting for the opponents to spout off their voice lines, get dealt cards, decide what they're doing. It's easily the biggest complaint I have about this mode. Otherwise, it feels like a pretty cool puzzle challenge, and I felt super accomplished for having earned this one. So now it's time to circle back around to finish out Night Terror. This was more difficult than the first one, for sure, but I beat it on the first try by the skin of my teeth. I made use of every last resource I had, even knifing down Jack and Emolded at one point in the second wave, so I could get earlier uses of the locked compactors. I used my previous strategy of buying as many weapons as possible, made even easier now by the addition of stat upgrades, the launcher and the magnum. I went for the shotgun upgrade first, and stretched the value of the bullets as far as I could before falling back on traps and the magnum for later waves. The first couple magnum purchases were cheap, but the price ramped quickly, so I used everything else I'd earned to upgrade and hoard ammo for the final wave. It made all the difference, because I camped the open area with stun traps, and it made one-tapping the molded very free. Jack rolled around for the final battle, and besides one close call in this corridor here, he got led around like a dog on a leash. Like I said, I really enjoyed this one, and just wish there was a bit more to it. This leads us into the next DLC, Jack's 55th birthday party! Woo! In a way, this is kind of like a hyper version of Nightmare, but instead of wave defense, it's a speedrun challenge. There's several levels, which addresses my previous issue with Nightmare, and the objective in each one is to get as many food items as you can to Jack to fill up his hunger bar. You get to pick a loadout with which you'll run through the levels, killing enemies, which earns you extra time and unlocks certain doors. There are mini-bosses and power-ups too, rounding it out as a full arcade experience. Now, the achievements for this one require an S rank on all levels, and for Jack to eat one of each food type, and then finally to finish a level with 10 minutes or more of bonus time remaining. The food one is pretty hard to miss by the end, but the S rank can be difficult and you actually have to try for the 10 minutes. So it goes like this. You'll have one level unlocked at the start, and you'll run through it pretty easily, earning some rewards for whatever rank you achieved and probably unlocking the next level, which will be a harder level. You'll use your better rewards to help you get through that level, and so on and so forth until you've beaten all the levels, or maybe you'll go back and get better ranks on previous levels instead. Either way, you're making progress and earning new stuff to play with. This is great, especially because of the ramping difficulty. At some point, you'll have enough to really feel like you can start achieving S ranks, which may not have felt possible before, at least not without some difficulty. More than that though, you'll also have to plan out a good route for your strategy, and there are a few viable strategies I think, though there are a couple that seem much better that take advantage of some of the perks that give you power at the cost of defense. You're also contending with inventory management and your own game knowledge, as you have to remember where the food is and what combines into what, because you can mix certain foods together to get much bigger bonuses, and those aforementioned perks require some careful consideration. Now, this is a lot of information for what boils down to a game mode that I only spent a fairly brief time on, and the reason I bring it up at all is so I can talk about why this might be one of the best DLCs for the game, despite it annoying the hell out of me. I'll start by posing the question, what is Resident Evil if not a bunch of puzzles, inventory management, and shooting with a spooky coat of paint over top? Well, it's an experience. And I've used that word a few times throughout this video, but it really is the best way to describe much of what makes these games special. Surviving the scares and scavenging to find all the hidden goodies that make you feel like you have a fighting chance is kind of addicting. Well, this game mode strips away the experience and leaves you with what's left of the gameplay. In a way, it's kind of a detox, because despite thinking I wanted to skip the lengthy intro and Zoe's phone calls, and to shut Lucas up every time he spoke, those were the parts that made the shooting and mastering the puzzles and remembering item locations and all of that other stuff feel so rewarding. So I'll briefly talk about my run. I cleared the levels with normal guns, accepting an S rank on the first stage, a B on the second, and working for an S on the third, which unlocked the Golden Crowbar, a melee weapon that could one-shot almost everything. This kept my inventory as open as possible so I could pick up the speed and time perks and still have a good few slots left over for food. I'd run through, die, reload, try to memorize the parts that worked and what didn't, and then I'd retry over and over again, refining the route until I made it work. I went through each level and backtracked a few times until I finally had everything beat with an S rank except for the last two levels, and they were pretty difficult for me because they were so big. But when I S ranked the main house 2 level, probably the biggest pain point in the whole thing, I got the gold blaster, and I imagine everything would have been easier if I'd gotten this earlier, because it has infinite ammo and shoots giga fast. That's probably why it's locked behind the hardest level now that I think about it. Anyway, I used it to clear testing area 2, and that wrapped up the achievement. And I mention this because I want to stress how tight some of these timings were. I think Main House 2 took me upwards of 10 tries or maybe more, which probably meant that the risky strategies were intended to be used, which proves how tightly tuned it is. And I think this DLC really got me thinking about how all of Resident Evil 7 is kind of like that. I think it's why you always just have enough items in Madhouse. It's how you have to be smart with how you spend your scrap in something like Nightmare, and why winning 21 felt so deliberate. It's also why I was so disappointed with some of the stuff coming up, but we're not there quite yet. Anyway, my closing remarks on Jack's birthday was that it was just a little too much effort to be top tier fun. I think Nightmare was better, but it definitely felt good to finish, and was exactly what I needed to start feeling like my Resident Evil itch had been scratched. Too bad for me that some of the hardest challenges were still to come. On to Not a Hero, and to keep it simple, it is an epilogue story where Chris Redfield goes through the deeper parts of the mines and shoots Lucas to death. Now Chris is way more combat proficient than Ethan, so you get access to some very powerful weapons and the ability to dominate with melee combat using perfectly timed guards to parry, and the option to punch staggered molded. You walk through different sections of the mines and get upgrades to your gear from your dead comrades that allow you to progress. And it has its own antique coins and unlockables too. So that's the sum of it, and I liked it quite a bit. On normal. Unfortunately, I had to beat this on professional for the achievement, and that's where my problem started. I really was starting to feel the fatigue, and while normal difficulty curbed that a little because playing as Chris is actually pretty fresh, the absolute bullshit of professional was enough to make me nauseous. To start, you have no weapons until later on, so you must be great at parrying and meleeing, which you likely won't be because you don't have a reason to be if you play normal. Well, normally. On top of this, the enemies do a ton of damage, enough to two-shot you most of the time, and combine this with sections like here, where this giant invincible white molded is roaming, and you can see why it might be frustrating. It took a few tries to figure out its aggro range and to work around its stupid pathing to lure it into these traps instead of dying to them myself, but my god, I felt like a beast when I finally got it done. And that was just the first challenge. I got lucky with these molded despawning after my death because trying to punch out 7 molded is annoying to say the least. Then of course they'd have you run this gauntlet without a gun too while trying to dodge the invincible white molded here, alongside crawlers, turrets, and more in the corridors. At least they give you the pistol in the next section finally so you can shoot the suicide fatties. Oh, finally I got a pistol. The ammo is too scarce for anything else though, so it's back to the knife for the next section. And if it wasn't apparent how painful this was yet, there are these little dudes, chilling in the middle of this explosives room that don't really seem to care about just making you restart for giggles. And then finally you get the shotgun and start to find some ammo, just in time for the boss fight against the giant, which is perhaps the most annoying boss fight in the entire game. It just doesn't die until you go through every single piece of ammo, and that means you have to somehow survive the onslaught of puke, bombers, and belly bumps while you burn it. After that, this horde fight against the molded seems downright easy, if not excessive, and after looting the lab and getting to Lucas, it's a pretty standard boss fight. Obviously it's doable, but my god, nothing about it was enjoyable, because it goes against everything that I just mentioned about Resident Evil being good. There's no progression, no fun puzzles, nothing new to discover, no mastery outside of the cheap punching and blocking gimmick, and worst of all, it's just annoyingly designed, with stuff like the little bombers and the tripwires. At least the punching and parrying came back with End of Zoe, so it's not a total waste. Except it is, because it all works differently. Again, I knew what to expect from normal mode because I'd played through it before, but I would like to gush about just how ridiculous the premise of this one is. I actually love Joe, and the few cutscenes are a treat. Playing through normal is a lot of fun because he feels so ridiculously strong. Except against the crawlers, those guys still suck. I took normal as an opportunity to grab the achievement for finishing the game without using weapons. That meant no using spears, and it was actually quite troublesome thanks to the gators. It took a lot of tries trying to figure out where I had to stand or walk to avoid getting mauled by them, but at least it was consistent. Upon beating it, you unlock the AMG, and you basically need it for Joe Must Die difficulty. Before that though, I saw I could unlock something called the Spirit Blade if I beat the extreme challenges on normal. Based on everything I knew about this game so far, it sounded pretty useful, and I needed to get at least one extreme challenge done anyway, so I thought why not? Extreme challenges are broken down so that they fit into the 10 heaviest gameplay sections throughout the run. Most of them were pretty straightforward, since the gameplay itself isn't different. There were a couple sections I had to retry, and some that were very close, but overall it wasn't too bad, especially since I had access to the weapons again, including the double barrel and the super fist. Ironically, one of the hardest sections was a gator section, because I didn't realize that I could just walk straight to the house, and kept going the long way around, which caused me to miss the timer by less than a second, and I had to fully reload. The worst part though was here, where there's a checkpoint halfway through, and if you're too slow in the first part, you have to do another hard reload to try again. I guess it's kind of nice since you don't have to nail a full 3-minute section, but my brain told me to keep trying until I knew it was impossible. Second time though, I finished with over a minute remaining, so it was very achievable with a little practice. I finished up super quickly by throwing all the hoarded supplies I had at Jack and claimed my Spirit Blade. At this point, I didn't really know what the Spirit Blade did, so I was a little confused when multiple hits didn't do seemingly any damage to these molded. I thought a weapon that didn't do damage seemed pretty useless, but it wasn't until later on that I made good use of its healing properties. That said, it took me a good while to acclimate to Joe Must Die difficulty. It was way harder. Still, using hit and run tactics and taking the time to figure out little tricks made each section easier, like here where I used the throwing knife to lure this guy out by himself. There were also many more traps in this difficulty, and figuring out how to use them to my advantage was crucial. There were some pretty infuriating spots, and I really dislike gotcha moments like this trap here. Maybe there's some merit to killing your players that I'm too dense to understand. You know, plenty of games have done it, like Ghosts and Goblins infamously, but I really just don't like it at all. Especially in a game where I know they have great ideas, it felt lazy to do, and every single cheap death pushed me further and further to boredom, because getting back was never a matter of skill, it was just a waste of time. To make matters worse, this difficulty brought back cassettes to save, so the annoyance was amplified by 10. At least the crocs were still manageable. The riverboat was exceptionally bad because it was a gauntlet of sneaking, luring, and picking the right fights, which made every attempt take forever. This was the point where I finally started taking advantage of the Spirit Blade, and it was instrumental in prolonging my life in the best attempts. After a couple of very unfortunate incidents with some more questionably placed traps, I finally got to the boss fight. I tried out the Spirit Blade here too, and it wasn't very efficient, though with enough patience it could heal me up. I was wise enough to the attack patterns so that I could use hit and run AMG punches to whittle him down, and that made it pretty easy. The molded out here were a dirty trick, but I used them to heal up and got on with the next section. The gators here were a bit different, but not different enough to throw me off. By this point I absolutely expected the toy gator to be replaced by a real one. What sucked more was once again the traps in this strategically placed fat molded. Once I solved this 200 IQ box puzzle, though, I could at least just run past it. This next part was real bad though. Naturally, everything was blocked off by traps and obstacles, so it was another die, reload, and repeat section. I will say it was at least somewhat of a unique gimmick because the gators had to be kited around. But then there's this guy. I don't know what I expected, but punching clearly wasn't the right way to deal with it. After running all the way back, it was about throwing knives at these explosives, which I thought was kinda neat. I was stoked when no other enemies blocked my path, and there was a save point right afterwards. It was around this time, here, at this trail of boxes, that I started noticing a peculiar ticking sound coming from some of them. And I started paying more attention. Turns out you can, in fact, know which ones are trapped from the sound and the tape pattern. This would prove extremely useful. I crafted up a bunch of stuff to keep my inventory from overflowing and hopped into the graveyard expecting a really difficult fight. It was worse than I expected. On the second try, I found that I could potentially pull them away from each other, and so I spent a few attempts trying to be stealthy. This proved successful, and thanks to the arsenal I crafted, I took down the surprise double fatty ambush without having to do it twice. Last stretch, you're stranded on the shore with no items, and this fight is pure pain. It took 7 tries before I accepted my fate, and spent 2 agonizing minutes getting off a single weak punch, one after the other, running to do it again and again before they died. Then I found this throwing knife, just to end up throwing it at this molded on accident, punching it to death anyway, and realizing it was the only thing I could use to move forward, and so it was all for naught. At least on the reload I could make a bolt for the AMG. I made a quick save here and did the final mad dash to the end. I grabbed every item out of my stash, I threw every last bit of it at Jack. It really came down to dodging, defending, and healing, though. The harder difficulty made it a pretty good boss fight, honestly, but man, I was happy to end it. Joe Must Die done, and thank God I didn't have to do Extreme Plus because there ain't no way that infinite weapons are worth getting. Alright, we're at the end now, and I saved the worst for last. Ethan Must Die isn't fun, and I don't think it's supposed to be. It's a prestige challenge, and in the same fashion as Joe Must Die, it's not particularly difficult so much as it's just a giant waste of time. I'm just going to let my successful run go in the background, and every single thing that appears on screen killed me at some point. I'll be honest, I looked up a guide after I made it to the upstairs section for the first time because getting there was so monotonous that I wanted to end it. The only true test of skill is when you get to Marguerite at the end, and realistically, it's only a challenge because the old house is also booby-trapped to hell. I don't know why the creators decided that cheap traps would be their endgame, but here we are, and I'm just thankful it wasn't a bigger part of the game because more than this would have sent me over the edge, I fear. The winning strategy is ammo conservation, letting the enemies kill themselves on the traps as much as possible and shuffling around whatever good guns you get to stretch the bullets as far as possible because you'll want them for the boss fight. A few enemies need to be shot, but the majority of them can be lured or run around, so again, once you know the intended way to progress, it's not really skill-based. This makes the item randomization pointless, in my opinion, and only serves to amplify frustration when you lose the Magnum or the Albert, and you know you likely won't get it next run, because they're too rare. Still, you can get fairly consistent runs, because all the weapons are good enough to beat her, since traps and turrets will probably deal the majority of the damage to her anyway. When I beat her on my second arrival, I'm pretty sure I only did so because she got stuck or lost and ate an entire turret worth of lead for dinner somewhere off screen. You know, I'll take it. Overall, I counted 15 tries, each one averaging somewhere between around 10 to 15 minutes probably. I felt like I'd mastered the game at this point, heated in the fires of hell and hammered by traps into unbreakable steel, but I also felt like I'd seen everything it had to offer multiple times over. I was ready to be done, completely and utterly, and thankfully, I was. Now, when I think about what makes a game worth completing, it's not necessarily about how much fun I had. Fun is great, yes, but so is satisfaction. I felt tired, but I'd be lying if I didn't say I felt satisfied. Everything was achievable with enough patience and perseverance, and as I said before, it was all a very tightly tuned experience. So despite being frustrated in those moments, I knew there was always a clear way forward, and those frustrations were never because the game didn't work or because I was being cheated. They were the product of a battle of wits between myself and the game. And I won the battle, ha ha ha. So Resident Evil 7 wasn't the perfect game by any means. I'll cover for its flaws a little bit, but if I'm being blunt, the DLC wasn't nearly as good as the main game. I really wish it didn't waste so much time with annoying mechanics and self-indulgent cutscenes, but the parts I enjoyed, I really enjoyed. I think the achievement composition was pretty much perfect too, blending story, mastery, and challenge achievements in more or less equal amounts, and finishing the collectibles led to something tangible. The game modes themselves aside, I'm glad there was a reason to play them all, though I am very grateful that it was lenient in not making me do Extreme Plus on End of Zoe, or Speedrun Deathless, or some craziness like that. Most importantly, the core of it was good. And so, to kick off the tier list, I think I'm putting Resident Evil 7 in B tier. Subject to change. Maybe somewhere down the line, after a few more games, I could see myself moving it up, because I almost put it in A tier, but my gut kept telling me it was too high. It's definitely not S or C tier though, I know that much for sure. Anyway, I look forward to completing more, and I hope you found this entertaining, if nothing else. Thanks for watching, see you next time. Hopefully in sooner than a year or two this time. Okay, bye.